welcome. It's fine shul. When we get into Parshas Vayikra and the Korbanos, so we find a fascinating thing here. Let me just get the pasuk. We find that the Gemara in Menachos says, Nema b'vehema reach nichach. Okay, again, without getting into the whole concept of Korbanos, which is big, I recently found a sefer that brings a lot of explanations of Korbanos and what they do and how to understand and relate to them better, which is something we all need to do when we get to Sefer Vayikra. But the description is this idea of reach nichach, this sweet smell. Right? Now it says that if a person brings a korban of a behema, which means like an ox, u'ba'ov, or a sheep, ba'ov, by the korbanos of birds, it says reach nichach. U'v'mincha, which is the korban just of a bit of flour and oil, reach nichach. So the Gemara says, what principle does this teach us? Lomar lecha, echad hamarbe, ve'echad hamamit, u'v'uvad she'yichavin li b'al hashamayim. Okay, in other words, it's sweet to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whatever you bring. It doesn't matter to him. You brought this big animal, bird, flour, all reich nichach l'Hashem. And here comes this principle, which we find many times brought in halacha as well, that echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit, it's all one and the same. If you do more, you do less. U'lovad she'yichavin li b'al hashamayim. As long as you are right, directing your intention to the Shemaim, to what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. Now this is brought in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch when it comes to davening. Okay, the Lashon that the Torah brought is he says, Echad hamarbe, ve'echad hamamit, u'vilvad she'yichavin libo b'tachanunov. So applied to tefillah, right, it's, just to recap for a second, right? We bring the Gemara in Menachos that says, with Korbanos, that it says reach nichach by a behema, it says reich nichach by an oaf, it says reich nichach by a korban mincha. It teaches the principle, echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit u'vad she'yichavin li b'al hashamayim. It's the same, one who does more, one who does less, as long as your kavanah is l'shamayim. So the Torah brought this down in davening, in Siman Aleph, really, it's Hanhagas Adam Baboker, it's called. And the way he phrased it is, Echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit, and now applying it to Tefillah, u'vad she'yichavin libo b'tachanunov. As long as you are having kavanah in your Tefillah. Okay? And he says, Ki tov ma'at b'kavanah, meharbos b'hem shelo b'kavanah. Because it's better, right, to have a little bit of things that you say in davening. This is talking about adding in, let's say, piyutim and all sorts of other things, than to say a lot without kavanah. Okay, that seems to make sense to us. But the Taz asks a very fascinating question, just in trying to work out the calculation here. The Taz asks, he says, V'koshemi monavshach. He says, this just doesn't seem to fit. We say echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit, right? That one who does more, one who does less is the same, but the main thing is you have to have kavanah. So he says, if we're talking about that they both have kavanah, it's the same if one does more and one does less, as long as they have kavanah l'shamayim. If they both have kavanah, why would more be the same as less? In other words, more is still more. If a person says, right, I'll say for Tehillim with kavanah, so that's more than saying one parak of Tehillim with kavanah. It says, why would you say it's the same? Okay, in the same way, let's move it to another thing. Let's take it to the idea of a donation. If somebody wanted to give to this fine shul, Kilat Chaverim, right, he's saved up, he's a poor man, he's saved up, and he gives 100 shekel to the shul. And another fine person, he saves up and he gives $1 million to the shul. Okay, so they both do it with full kavanah, they both do it with love, they both do it, but with all due respect, one is $1 million and one's 100 shekel. Right? Alex is not going to honoring the dinner, I think, the guy gave the 100 shekel, it's probably going to be after the whole reconstruction and all these things, probably the person who gave the million is going to be the headliner. So that's what the Taz is asking. You can say kavana, with kavana is better than without kavana. But how can you say echad hamarbe v'echad hamamit if we're talking about when they both have kavana? V'i below kavana, and if we're talking about people who don't have kavana, meaning one guy saying one parak of Tehillim without kavana, another person saying whole sefer Tehillim without kavana. But then why does he conclude kitov ma'at b'kavana meharbe shelo b'kavana? It can't be talking about that they're both not having kavana, because the conclusion is it's better to have a little bit with kavana. So this leads him to the following explanation. Pay attention, and Hebrew grammar is important. I don't understand that all that well, but there are times when you look and you say, it doesn't say echad harbe ve'echad ma'at, that a lot is the same as a little. It uses the verb hamarbe, one who does a lot, and hamamit, one who limits, one who does less. Okay, so therefore, the Taz explains like this. He says, if you apply it to davening, right, one person who expands the davening, says more things, does more songs, whatever it is, l'shem shamayim, that is the same as a person who shortens his davening, l'shem shamayim. It's not talking about the actual product in the end. It's talking about the process. If both people have the kavanah, that the davening should be with kavanah and l'shem shamayim, so then echad hamarba, the act of doing more, and the act of doing less, those are equivalent. Okay? He says sometimes a person can't have kavanah for so long. Tov lekatzer lechavim. Okay, so that's why it's better to have ma'at b'kavanah meharbe shelo b'kavanah. So says the Taz. Now the Sfas Emes, we learn each week, he brings down the Taz, and he praises his answer. He says, Ayin shom shemeyashev b'tuv tam v'das. Right, that's a very nice answer. And we find it in different ways. Like I saw a story, there was a great Talmud Chacham here in Yerushalayim, Reb Chaim Brim. And he gave very exciting, engaging shiurim. Once he was invited to speak at a certain occasion, they were going to have a few shiurim, and he gave a very dry, boring shiur. And people couldn't understand if he was sick or something like that. And somebody close to him found out that he was a little worried that he would overshadow the next speaker, who was not such a dynamic speaker. So he toned his down. There was a story I saw, I don't remember the Rav who was involved. There was a certain community where the chazan passed away, and they were interviewing new potential chazanim. And there was one chazan who stood out beyond the pack. He was just fabulous. So the board, members of the shul, whatever, were saying, obviously we're going to be taking him. The Rav said, no, I want to take that other guy who really wasn't such a great chazan. And they said, why? He says, because the almana, the widow of that chazan, is going to be sitting in the Ezras Noshim. And if you bring out this fabulous chazan, everybody goes, he's amazing. He's so much better than the old chazan. It's going to kill her. Better should have a chazan who's not as good as her previous husband. Right? Meaning, hamamit, you're limiting. You're cutting down, but it's l'shem shamayim. Right? That is the same as doing something more, which also is sometimes appropriate, l'shem shamayim. Right? To get a fabulous chazan, which is there, that's going to really, right, raise the kavanah of everybody. It all depends on your kavanah and how it works out. So that's the Taz's explanation. The Sfas Emes goes on to say, though, afal piche near the kusha me'ikara lesa. He says, the question really doesn't even start. That's what that means in Aramaic. Kusha me'ikara lesa. The question isn't there. Because he says, be'emes ein hefresh bein marbe lemamit im shnei miskavnim latov. Meaning the Taz's supposition, which is, you can't say that a lot is the same as a little if both people have kavanah. Again, that donor with $1 million has kavanah. The donor who gives 100 shekel, he also has kavanah. you can't say that that's the same. The Sfas Emes says, you know what? You can. He says you can. Because in real terms, in Torah terms, he says, Ba'avodas habari ein nafkamina beriboy. He says, there is no difference. He says, quantity doesn't really play a part. He says, Rak be'is'orus rotzon emes balev. Only the awakening of a true rotzon in the heart. This is an earth-shaking chiddush, right? What this means is that the mitzvahs that we do, and again, certain mitzvahs have a minimum threshold that you have to do. We're not talking here, right, about not eating enough matzah at all, right, or something on Pesach. There are shiurim, there are measures for different things that we do. But he says it all depends on a person's abilities and intentions, because it's really the heart that matters. So he's saying that Jew who saved up his $5 to give to the shul, and that Jew saved up the $1 million, it really is the same. And it could very well be that person who gave the $5, it's even worth more in Shamayim than those $1 million, because it was more difficult for him. It was hard. He says that's what matters. It's as if the mitzvah, the actual mitzvah you're doing, is a way of connecting your heart to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that can take whatever form it takes. It can be big, it can be little. That doesn't really matter. Okay? We can see this if you want to take almost a ridiculous comparison. If we have Gedolei Torah, you have a Gadol Torah who's not very tall. Rav Moshe Feinstein was not very tall. He didn't reach 5 feet. They tell a story that there was a boy who was getting picked on a bit in school because he was not very tall, he was quite short, and his father brought him to Rav Moshe, and Rav Moshe said, I know some short people who can learn very well. In other words, that would be ridiculous to be comparing great Talmidei Chachamim. We'll say, well, he's 6 feet, right? That's a lot more than Rav Moshe's 4'9". It's totally immaterial. In that field, it really doesn't matter. In the same way, in terms of what giving tzedakah to a shul does, $1 million and $5, it doesn't really matter. You'll say, wait, but this gives a new building, that gives... But in Shemayim, that doesn't take significance. That's simply a portal, a way for you to channel your heart and accomplish what you do. Okay? And we see the Minchas Ani, right, is described as nefesh kisakriv. Chazal bring down, Rashi brings down, because the ani, the poor person who can only bring some flour and oil because he can't afford anything else, and even that is a stretch for him. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "Mala ni olav kilu hikriv nafsho." I consider that as if he brought his entire life. Meaning, what's bigger? It's that korban mincha in the spiritual sense. Now, for a person who's very wealthy to bring the korban mincha won't accomplish that. Not at all, because the entire aspect of it, the difficulty, the mesiras nefesh, the love is not there with that. And he has to bring that larger korban according to who and where he is. Okay, so he says, va'adarabba, right? He says even more so, mi she'eno yochol lasos harbe, u'mechavim b'hama'at efshe choshuv yoseh. A person who can't do a lot, but he really has his intention with the little, it can be more important. Again, as I say, it's shocking. One person has a tremendous mind, and he learns all of Shas with Rishonim and Achronim back and forth. And another person has been chipping away, learning a bit of Maseches Brachos every day for a few years. Right? He's saying, Efsher Choshuv Yoseh. And he does it with all of his heart and soul, with all of the kavanas that you should have to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Torah, and all those different things. That can be Choshuv Yoseh. That can be more. It's we have to change our eyeglasses. That's what this earth-shaking Chazal is saying. So he says, another aspect of it, he says, is nira haperush marbe umamit beinyan mei hatova v'imei hara. You have to also understand that there are days, right? There's an idea of what's called the good days and the bad days, so to speak. Okay, in Koheles it says, B'yom tova heye b'tov u'v'yom ra'a re'eh. On a good day, do your best. On the bad day, so you should prepare for it. You should anticipate it. There are some days when you have what's called mochin the gadlus. Mochin the gadlus means you get it, you feel it, you're full of energy and positivity and desire to do the right thing, and you do that stuff. But there are other days in which you simply don't have that. And you can't do as much. You can't do it in the same way on those days. He says, echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit applies to those as well. There's some days in which you can do more. If you do them more on those days, that's wonderful. But there are some days in which you can't do that. You can't do that as much. You just simply, that's what you have there. So you're doing less, but it's the same. If you're trying to put your heart into it, what you have limitations. So the Slonimer Rebbe, as a kuntris, it was based on shurim he gave to people in the first 10 years of marriage. I think it can definitely be extended into my zone of over 30, right? But he says that a lot of times in life you'll discover after you're married that you're not feeling anything in your Yiddishkeit. It says you're not feeling Shabbos, you're not feeling Yontiv, you're not feeling it. He says, and that's understandable. He says because you're learning to live with a member of another species, which is very difficult, right? If you have children, they are young enough, they're able to make a huge amount of distraction and mess and all sorts of stuff. They're certainly not old enough to help. Your finances often aren't that stable at that point. There are many questions in your life in finding your way. So he says, therefore, it's understandable that will be. So what are you supposed to do? He says you should try to do things as if you felt it, meaning to do the most you can, the best you can at that time. And that will build tremendous strength in you that, again, you will connect with later. Like the famous word to the Kotzker. We say in Kriya Shema, let the words that I'm commanding you today be on your heart. Ask the Kotzker, why do we want it on the heart? We want it in the heart. He says, because many days your heart is closed. He says, keep learning and keep davening on the days when your heart is closed. Let it sit on the heart. And there'll be that time when the heart opens and then it'll all go in. So that's the idea of the Yomim Tovim and the Yomim Roim. Okay, so this is the Sfas Emes' approach, even though he praised the approach of the Taz, and we can see that, but he goes back to that original supposition that the Taz says is both people have kavanah and one does a lot and one does a little. You can't say that the two are the same. He says actually in Shamayim the two are the same. Those two are equivalent. Now, there's something that still doesn't fit though, because it does talk about different korbanos, meaning it tells us that one brings an oath, one brings a mincha, and each person has to bring something different. So going back to the Taz's explanation, why do we say echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamit in terms of the korbanos? Meaning the korban you bring is really dependent on your finances, right? Remember, going back to the Taz, he said it's a verb, hamarbe ve'hamamit. So the guy who brings a mincha, brings a little flour, he says, oh, I'm being mamit. I'm limiting the korban I'm giving. No, you're not. You can't afford it anymore, right? The person who brings the behema, he's not saying, I'm being marbeh. No, you're halachically obligated to bring the behema if you can afford it. So in what's called the korban olav yored. So here the Sfas Emes in another year addresses this in a fascinating way, and it's a real reflection of the roots of Ger Chasidus in Kotsk. He brings again this limud of echad hamarve ve'echad hamamit. So he says, again, Eina kavana al hefresh shovyo shel hakorban. The kavana can't be for the difference in the actual financial value of the korban. The kachli dinar kachli me'amona klape shmaya. Again, he repeats his approach that there's no difference whatsoever in Shamayim if a person gives 100 or a person gives 1,000. He says, "Ochein be'emes kavanosam gam al hamamit she'en lo das." Chazal say famously, "Ein ani elo b'das." That when we talk about poverty and wealth, in Torah terms, true poverty and wealth comes in terms of das, which doesn't mean necessarily how much knowledge you've stored, but it means how much you're connected to Torah, how much you have there. So he says, a person sometimes has the option of bringing different korbanos, but ein lo das halos korban choshev. This was a new concept to me. He says, Ki bevadai godla maglas ha'ola ala mincha shu halos achai v'ze halos ha'tzomech. He says, a korban ola in which an animal is brought is a higher level tikkun. Okay, again, this involves studying a bit what korbanos do, and this whole idea that we bring in the korbanos, the animal, the mineral, the vegetable, and connect them to their source. So he says, to be male the chai, something which is an actual living creature, and to connect it to its source, is a bigger avoda than to connect it tzomech. Afal pichen mishemakiris mekomo, he says, sometimes a person is honest with himself. He recognizes where he is. Bocher b'ma'at ashiyeh be'emes milikpotz l'mala mimadregasa. He chooses to do something smaller, but it'll be true, it'll be real, than to jump above his madrega. Okay? Again, I can't say I understand what these korbanos are, but he's talking about a Jew who's a real Oved Hashem, and he's coming to bring a korban, and he could bring an animal korban, but he says, I don't have it. I don't have the kavanah necessary to do the spiritual work that has to be done with that. I'm not on the level to do that. I can only manage to accomplish what has to be accomplished with a korban mincha. I'm going to do that because that's going to be emes. That's going to be real. The people looking around might say, what's he bringing such a cheap little korban for? What does he do? But I want to do it the emes. Right? Kotsk, when they summarized Kotsk in one word, it was all about emes. Right? To do that which is real. And this idea of not jumping above your madrega. He says, the idea of trying to do something when you're, and again, we're not talking about basic halachas, you have to try your best in, but many things people jump in and they try to do things that they're really not there internally. He's implying that that's an aspect of sheker that you shouldn't do. Okay, again, it doesn't mean, right, like the Mesilas Yesharim talks about the idea that if you're not feeling excited about something, your midas hazrizus of energy is not activated, so one way to do so is to throw yourself into it and do it energetically, and that wakes up the soul. Okay, that's fine. That's with it. But the idea of going where you're not is dangerous. The Vilna Gaon talks about this on Mishlei, right? He talks about a person who takes a wrong path and then gets angry at Hashem. He said that wrong path is a person who didn't choose v'yishuv hadas, the path of avoda that's proper for him now. He tried to jump madregas, and he gets angry that Hashem didn't help me. He said, Hashem, I decided I was going to sleep 2 hours a night and, do all sorts of learning and service for you, and I got sick. Where were you? You let me down. He said, no, you made a stupid decision. That was not right for you. That was not there. And that's that lack of emes. So he says, that's the idea that we're talking about here. He says, and this can explain what the Taz said. To be mamit l'shem shamayim means I'm going to do less because I want it to be real. I'm going to do less because I want it to be real, as opposed to doing something more that's going to be fake. And he says, Zeh haratzon emes chashuv lefanav yaseh. This idea of wanting to do something true and real is more chashuv to Hashem. That's ke'ilu hikriv nafsho. He says that really is, it's a sacrifice a person makes. A person oftentimes, you want to impress people, you want to impress yourself. But he says, if you're real and you do what's real and what's right for you at the time, that sacrifice to Hashem is very precious because it's very true. Okay, now let's just apply this to Pesach, which is coming up, and the line in the Haggadah that seems to contradict this. Okay, because it says in the Haggadah, whoever, right, does more, tells more the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim is more praiseworthy. And it brings the story of the Chachamim who were sitting in Bnei Brak and going until the Talmidim came and said, Rabbi Seinu Igi Azman Kriya Shema Shel Shachris. So this has created this cultural phenomenon of this competition that happens in Shul the next day was, how late did you go? All right, how late did you go? 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 o'clock in the morning. We went till 4:30. Another person says 4:30. We're still in the middle. We took a break for Shacharis. All this, and it's become this competition which is there. So isn't that what it says? No. First of all, when you look carefully at the words, it doesn't say, it uses a very strange way of phrasing it. It doesn't say, Yesh laharbos b'sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. One should do a lot of telling of the story of Mitzrayim. It says, Kol hamarbe l'saper b'Yitzias Mitzrayim. One who is marbe, specifically l'saper, we'll get to that in a second, harei zeh meshubach. Behold, he is praiseworthy. It's a strange way of constructing it. So what I saw in the Mefarshim on the Haggadah, there are many approaches to it, but basically the following. It's not talking about quantity. It's not talking about torturing your family or your guests or any of those things. It's talking qualitatively. How do we know that? Because the famous difference between Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim that we do every day and Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim is that it has to be like telling a story. Telling a story is something which is done with heart, with emotion, with being totally in there. A good storyteller brings you into the world of his book, right? That's the idea of telling the story. I point out in Parshas Yisro, it says that Yisro heard about what happened to Am Yisrael and he came to join Am Yisrael in the Midbar. Then Vayesaper Moshe l'chosno. Moshe told his father-in-law what Hashem did for them. And Yisro bursts out in praise, Baruch Hashem asher yitzil eschem yad param yad Mitzrayim. But Yisro, you already knew that. Why are you suddenly doing this? They said it was because of Vayisaper. Before he got news reports. Here Moshe Rabbeinu told him the story. They connect the word Vayisaper to the jewel, the sapir, right? It shines. It's a light. So if you tell the story in a way, then harei zeh meshubach, it doesn't say it's praiseworthy to make your Seder run for a long time. It says it shows that this person is a praiseworthy person. It shows that this person got it. He's excited about the story. He realizes that this is his life, which comes from and is dependent on that story. It means so much to him, and that's why he tells it that way. That's what's meshubach. I read recently, somebody brought quotes from a diary of a Talmud of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, and he went for Leil HaSeder to the famous Mashgiach who was there, of Shmuel Zelech, whatever his name was. He was a massive Talmud Chacham, he was a Mekubal, he was a tremendous tzaddik, and he describes the Seder that he ran in great detail. And part of it was, he said no Perushim on the Haggadah. No Perushim at all. He read it. But he said the way he read it, I felt so moved by it. I could feel in there all of his knowledge of all of the Sfarim HaKadoshim in the way he said those words. He said it was at the point, I actually didn't say the words myself. I just wanted to be writing along with his words. So Mar B'Lesaper isn't quantity of how many questions, how many answers, how many stacks of Haggadahs you have there with little sticky notes to bring this parish and that parish. Those things are nice and you can continue on throughout Pesach. But the Sipur itself is the story and how that's done. And according to our other parish, with the idea of Marbe and Mamit, like the Taz says, so sometimes if you keep the Seder shorter, or you do it in a way which is less lumdish, or all sorts of things, depending on who's there, harei zeh meshubach, right? That's what it is. I often quote David Kamenetsky, Shlita told me he was once at his grandfather's Seder. Once it was just him, his grandfather, his grandmother, one time. And he was looking forward to that very much. His grandfather was one of Gedolei Hador, and to hear what he would pour forth on the Haggadah. So he says, they started off, and he said a few perushim on the beginning. Then he said to him, the Bob is there for matet, right? Your grandmother's very tired, let's go. And they went through and they finished around 10 o'clock, 10:30. He was shocked. It was in Chutzlar, so there was a second night, a second Seder. He was expecting, okay, now again, the same thing happened. He said, grandmother's very tired, let's go, and they finished up. Echad hamam'it Some people feel that to do things at the level of the children who are there. There are different opinions about this, but Vayikra Nevin Shalshlit, the Rav of the old city, I remember he told us multiple times, he says that the Seder should be targeted to the youngest person or to the person who perhaps knows the least. Even if the other people will say, wait, where are your big brisker chakiras? Where are the deep lessons of Hasidus? All these kind of things. He says, no, this is the idea of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. That has to be the focus. Again, Echad HaMamit, right, in certain ways, in holding back on those things that you may want to do for yourself because you're a storyteller. And you have to be able to bring people into the world of your story. So it takes a lot of hachana, right? You can't just jump into the story. A person has to think and feel beforehand about what it means, how it connects. One little technique I have in my head, only because I read too many science fiction stories when I was a kid, is if you had a time machine. Okay, one of the phrases we use so much at the little Seder is anaylyzes. So you're sitting at your Seder, and you have a time machine where you can spin the dial. So you spin it 500 years back. You end up in a Jewish home, you'll find a Leil HaSeder, very similar to yours. Spin it 1,000 back, same thing, 1,500. On that coordinate in time, when you keep going back, you're always ending up in a Leil HaSeder. People's dress may change, some of the menu may change, but the basics are all there. That Leil HaSeder which is there. That story which happened and is happening, and the fact that you're doing that again, is the greatest story in the world. There's nothing that can match it, right? No Harry Potter, no Lord of the Rings, no anything. It's if we would realize how exciting our own story is, and that we're part of that story, and that it's there, then our Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim wouldn't need the 10,000 different commentaries and different things to get across. Then we'd be telling it as it should be. And then the Hallel, which is the peak, so to speak, of the Haggadah of the Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Gemara gives a fascinating description that I try to remember every year. It says, "Kazesa de pischa v'alela poka igra." The Korban Pesach had to be eaten indoors. You had to eat in your chabura, right? People had a group in which they were assigned on a Korban Pesach, and then they sat. But it would get hot and stuffy in the houses, Mefarshim say. Again, you imagine all the Ole Regel. Right? If you want to see an interesting discussion, Josephus, he brings down the description of Korban Pesach in the Beis Hamikdash. It's fascinating, talking about the Kohanim and all that they did to handle all the people in their Korban Pesach. So everybody would go up to the roof when it came time for Hallel. And everybody was singing Hallel. There at midnight on the roofs of Yerushalayim, the roofs were shaking from the Hallel. That's the Marbil Saper. That's what we're shooting for. And it's Hashem, remember, Echad HaMarbe v'Echad HaMamit, v'vad she'yechavin libo l'shamayim, and then hopefully all of our praises and Hallel and Bakoshas will be accepted l'ratzon. A wonderful Shabbos, a wonderful week.